Muriel arrived at the royal court on the back of a grain wagon. Curled beneath a torn wool blanket, her small hands clutched around a broken wooden spoon that had survived the fire. The spoon had once stirred porridge beside her mother's elbow, had once been used to tap rhythm against the pot as her little brother danced in the dirt behind the cottage. Now it was charred at the handle and smooth at the bowl, softened by heat and soaked in ash. It was the only thing she had brought with her. The rest, her voice, her home, her name said aloud by someone who loved her, had burned beneath the thatch. The villagers had said she was lucky. The queen's men had passed through, looking for girls to serve in the great marble house that overlooked the river bend. Most ran or begged to be spared. Muriel had not run. She had not begged. She had simply stood barefoot beside the ruin of her home, her face streaked with soot and her eyes emptied out. She had not spoken once since the fire. The guards thought her dumb from birth. They laughed when she didn't cry and poked at her ribs when she didn't flinch. The older one, with a scar beneath his chin, said maybe she'd fetch good coin in the city if she was too strange of court. But when they delivered her to the steward in the servant's wing, he looked her up and down, saw the silence in her mouth and the steadiness in her gaze, and nodded without a word. They didn't need orphans who screamed. They needed hands that moved fast and mouths that did not. She was given a cot in a drafty hallway, a gray shift too large for her shoulders, and a task that first morning to sweep the east corridor where the queen's ladies passed in the late afternoons. No one told her how to bow. No one explained what each bell meant. When she moved too slowly, she was struck. When she moved too quickly, she was scolded for disturbing the rugs. She did not cry. She learned quickly not to blink too long in one direction, not to leave smudges on the silver, not to be noticed. There were a dozen other girls who whispered behind their sleeves and shoved her toward the worst chores. She let them. She was too thin to fight and too tired to care. But she watched, and watching, she learned. The palace was colder than she'd imagined, not just in stone or draft, but in soul. Its beauty was sharp-edged. White marble shone like frost, and even in some of the great halls smelled of polished iron and lavender water, like morning prepared in advance. The queen was rarely seen by the lower servants. She moved like a myth to the higher levels of the palace, where rugs were thick enough to swallow footfalls and candles glowed in gilt chandeliers, always just out of reach. Muriel glimpsed her once in the shadowed corner of the servant's stair, saw the tilt of her head beneath a widow's veil, the ringless fingers pressed against her bodice as she walked past a soldier who did not meet her eye. She did not look cruel. She looked carved, like someone who had long since buried softness beneath years of quiet. It was another 2 years before Muriel was called to serve in the queen's own chambers. By then, she had outlasted all the other girls she had arrived with, growing into herself in the shadowed hours between dawn and duty. Her silence had become not just accepted but preferred. The older maids began to pass tasks to her they did not trust others to do. She was sent to handle the queen's books, her linens, her mirrors. They found they never had to tell her twice. She understood order the way others understood speech. She became a fixture in the queen's presence. She fetched a morning basin and placed it by the window, always warm but not steaming, just as the queen preferred. She laid out gowns without asking, never choosing color more than once a fortnight. The queen never spoke to her directly, but neither did she dismiss her. In the court, absence of displeasure was as close to favor as anyone dared hope. Years settled like snow on Muriel's shoulders. She learned the language of the queen's world, the rustle of a hem that meant irritation, the flick of a fan that meant boredom, the tightening of a glove that preceded a long silence. Muriel came to know these things as intimately as breath. She moved through her days without question or interruption. Her voice never returned, and in time, even she stopped listening for it. Then the queen bore a child. It was said she labored through 2 nights without sound, her cries muffled against the down of a pillow, so that the court might not think her weak. When the child was born, the bell did not toll. The king, older and long absent in temperament if not in flesh, acknowledged the son in writing, but did not return to the palace for months. The boy, Corin, was healthy, wailing, gold hair like a coin struck clean. The nurses passed him from one another like a task poorly defined. He bit, screamed, fought sleep. The queen held him only in ritual. She did not sing. She did not stay. On a night thick with thunder, when the wet nurse had left the nursery in tears, Muriel was asked to stand in for an hour, just until another could be found. She entered the nursery with bare feet, and her hands still cold from rinsing cloths. The boy screamed against the night like a broken blade. She lifted him without speaking, without noise at all, and something in her stillness met something in his. He blinked, fisted her shift in one small, startled hand and quieted. After that, she was asked again. Not often, not officially, but often enough. The queen never questioned it. Perhaps she noticed that Corin slept better. Perhaps she didn't care. Muriel never presumed. She remained a servant in name, in position, in posture. But in the nursery, in the silence between one breath and the next, she became something else. The child followed her with his eyes, tracked her movements like constellations in motion. When he was old enough to crawl, he followed her shadow. When he spoke his first word, it was not to her. She would not have heard it. But when he pointed the spoon she still carried in her apron pocket, tucked deep and worn smooth by years of habit, he smiled. As if he knew, Muriel began to understand something she could never say aloud. That even silence could be a kind of lullaby. That presence, steady and warm, could wrap around a child in ways no title or bloodline could define. She knew her place. She had no illusions. But she also knew that when Corin woke in the night with tears that did not stop, it was her arms that calmed him. That when he learned to walk, he took his first unsteady steps not toward the throne, but toward her. She never sat in the queen's chair. She never entered the throne room unless summoned. She was nothing and no one to the world outside the nursery door. But within those four painted walls, beneath the faded murals of stags and stars, she became what the child needed. Not a mother, not a nurse. Something quieter. Something rooted. Like a stone that catches firelight but never burns. Years passed like watered-down carved stone. Her face changed slowly, her body hardened by labor but softened around the eyes. She learned how to fold a royal mantle without creasing its trim. She learned how to clean blood from silk without fraying its sheen. She became indispensable in ways no one could name. And she remained silent. She did not know what she would have said, even if she could. What words could carry the shape of a life like hers? What language could define the ache that lived behind her ribs when Corin looked up at her with a question he didn't yet know how to ask? Sometimes, when he was very young, he would bring her things. A stone shaped like a heart, a feather with gold at its tip, a stick he claimed was a sword. And she would smile or nod, or place them carefully beside her on the cot while he watched her face. When he was older, he began to learn the ways of men. Lessons in politics and lineage, history and command. She saw the weight gather in his shoulders even as his voice grew stronger. But when he was tired, when the lessons pushed too hard against his spirit, he still came to her, sitting quietly at her feet, leaning his head against her knee as he once had against her chest. And Muriel, still voiceless, still nameless in the court's eyes, would rest her hand on his head, the way her mother once had before the fire took everything, and she would close her eyes and feel, for a moment, that nothing had been truly lost, only changed, only quieted. Like her, the years that followed turned slowly, like the winding of a music box long since forgotten beneath silk and cedar. Muriel remained ever at the queen's side, but not in the way that handmaidens were usually remembered. She was neither the chatter of gossip, nor the hum of perfume and powder. She was presence without weight, movement without sound, a figure who passed like morning mist between the queen's waking and dressing, between her solitude and her cold, calculated appearances in court. Elsinora never asked her to speak. She never once looked into Muriel's eyes as if expecting a response. But she allowed her near, in a world so ruled by distance and decorum. Proximity was power in its quietest form. Muriel understood the queen's rhythms long before anyone taught them to her. She learned which dresses Elsinora reached for when the air outside hung heavy with rain, how she sat stiffer when her sister came to call, how she touched the ivory comb on her table 3 times when she was bracing for news. These small patterns, barely noticed by even the most vigilant of attendants, were the language Muriel learned to read. Her silence honed her attention to a sharp edge. She was not simply mute. She was listening harder than anyone else in the palace. And because of that, she began to see things no one else did. The queen, for all her command and elegance, was profoundly lonely. It was not an obvious thing. Elsinora had mastered the art of poise. Her expressions were statuesque. Her words measured with surgical precision, and her presence among courtiers was polished to the point of intimidation. But Myrrel, ever silent and ever close, witnessed what others missed. The way the queen's hand lingered over the window latch before turning away. The way her mouth sometimes opened mid-thought only to close again, as though swallowing something too old for words. The way she sat for hours in the afternoon light, her back perfectly straight, her eyes unfocused as though somewhere far beyond the palace walls. The child Corin was growing. Each season marked a new change in his face, new defiance in his limbs, and a restless energy that no lecture or scroll could seem to calm. The queen's distance did not go unnoticed by him. Even as a boy, Corin seemed to sense the cold that lived between his birthright and his mother's gaze. He was not cruel to her, but neither was he tender. Their relationship was ritual, not blood. He stood when summoned, bowed when expected, and never asked why she rarely touched his hair or held his hand. But Myrrel knew the questions lived inside him. She saw it each time he looked up from a failed lesson and scanned the hall, not for a tutor or a knight, but for her. He was 7 when he began sneaking from his chambers to find her. It started with shy, half-hearted steps, his little boots scuffing the stone floors and the servants' passageways late in the evening. Myrrel would find him near the laundry rooms or beneath the spiral staircase that led to the West Tower, arms crossed tight across his chest, as though hiding the shame of needing someone. She never scolded him. She never gestured for him to return to his bed. She would simply hold out her hand, and he would take it, small fingers curling around hers with trust too deep for words. Together, they would walk the long, dark halls until the moonlight slanted to the eastern windows and sleep softened his eyes. As he grew older, Corin came to depend on her not just for comfort, but for understanding. He discovered that her silence allowed space for his thoughts to wander, for his emotions to breathe without the harshness of judgment. In the library, where Myrrel was sometimes sent to dust the upper shelves, he would sit across from her and read aloud passages from books far above his age, as though testing the weight of each word on his tongue. She never interrupted. She never corrected. But she listened in such a way that he felt wiser simply for speaking. Once, in the early days of autumn, Corin brought her a parchment torn from one of the histories he had been assigned. It was a story of an old king who had once ruled from the very palace they now inhabited, a man whose conquests were praised but whose personal life was written only in whispers. In the margins, a previous reader, perhaps a long-dead scholar or an overly curious page, had scribbled a question in ink barely visible. Who mourns a hand that steadies a crown? Corin handed it to her with a tilt of his head, the same tilt that mirrored hers when she was curious. She read the line, then looked up at him and nodded once. He smiled as if she had answered a question buried deeper than the page. By the time he was 9, the bond between them had become its own language. She began teaching him simple signs, not formal ones, but their own shorthand of gestures and movements, a private symphony of meaning. A brush of the fingers meant he was tired. 2 taps against his knee meant he had argued with his tutor. A hand drawn across the air like a curtain meant he wanted to escape, if only for a moment. In these conversations, Myrrel found her voice again, not in sound, but in significance. Corin never mocked her silence. He honored it. He carried it like a secret badge. But not everyone was blind to their closeness. The court was a place where affection raised suspicions more quickly than treason. Nobles who noticed a boy prince trailing after a mute servant with a fondness usually reserved for kin began to whisper. Myrrel heard in the way her name was twisted in the kitchen halls, how her presence was ignored with exaggerated disdain by some of the older ladies-in-waiting. They called her the ghost, the queen's shadow, the dumb wraith. But more than ridicule, there was unease, an unspoken fear that someone who could not speak could not be predicted, and what cannot be predicted cannot be controlled. Even within her own rank, Myrrel felt the shift. The other servants who once handed her their burdens with grateful indifference began to keep their distance. She received fewer glances, fewer smiles. She became more invisible in plain sight than ever before, And still, she did not retreat. She had lived too long beneath the weight of others' judgment to be moved by it now. She had found something stronger than approval. She had found connection. The queen, for her part, remained inscrutable. She never acknowledged the growing attachment between her son and Miro. She did not interrupt it, but neither did she condone it. If there was jealousy, it was buried too deep to surface. If there was recognition, it was never spoken. Miro sometimes wondered whether Elsinora saw herself in her son's need for someone gentle and present, or whether she had simply accepted that motherhood, like marriage, could be delegated. What Miro didn't know was that the queen's detachment never waned, not even on the boys' birthdays, not even when Corin rode a horse for the first time and fell, scraping both knees, and did not cry. It was Miro who held him afterward, Miro who knelt beside him in the stables, her hands wet with salve and her eyes steady. Corin never asked for his mother. Miro was already there. Seasons turned, and Corin's boy began to wear the shape of adolescence. His face sharpened, his voice deepened, but the bond remained. He no longer followed her from room to room, but he would still sit beside her in the courtyard during long afternoons, where snowdrops bloomed even when the cold tried to kill them. They spoke in their silent ways, their gestures now second nature, their understanding as natural as breath. Sometimes he would bring her things still, books he thought she'd enjoy, small stones he thought beautiful, a carved bird he had whittled himself. She kept them all tucked beneath the folded linens in her chamber, as if afraid that naming what they were would make them disappear. It was in these quiet days that Miro began to understand something she had not dared to believe possible, that in the hollow space her voice had left, something else had taken root, something deeper than duty, something more enduring than survival, a form of love that needed no declaration to be true. She had served the queen with unbroken silence, with loyalty forged in ash and tempered in years of service. But she belonged to the boy, not in title, not in blood, but in every word he had never said, and every moment he had chosen her instead. She often wondered what it would mean years from now when Corin became king, whether he would forget the way her hand steadied his as he first learned to wield a sword, or how her presence had calmed his fears when storms rattled the palace windows, whether the world would ever allow him to name her as anything more than servant, whether he would try. But for now, she did not think ahead. She thought only of the present, of the boy who still brought her feathers and secrets, and of the silence between them that had never felt like absence. For in that silence, she had been seen, not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as someone who mattered, as someone who endured, as someone who, without ever speaking, had taught a future king how to listen. The palace stood like a cathedral built from frost, beautiful in its design, yet always slightly too cold to touch. Its mirror halls reflected everything and absorbed nothing, and within their silence, Corin grew into a boy of contradictions, royal in blood, wild in spirit, and shaped more by quiet company than by the steel outlines of crown that waited above his future. By the time he was 10, he had grown tall enough to look eye to eye with some of the younger guards, and clever enough to know when their smiles were false. He moved through the court with a restlessness that rankled the tutors and confounded the queen's advisors. His hands were never still for long. If he was not climbing the narrow garden walls to peer at the stables below, he was crouching by the servants' courtyard to run his fingers through the dust, shaping it into maps no one else could read. His soul was not made for velvet and gold, but for movement, for wind, for the small, honest sounds of hooves on wet stone and wood smoke curling from the guard towers. Despite this, he was royal, and the court would not allow him to forget it. His lessons were doubled, then tripled. He was woken before sunrise to recite lineage and policy, taught which wines pair with venison, and which flowers must never be gifted to visiting queens. He was watched like a falcon in a cage, and though his tutors kept records of his achievements, none of them knew how often he escaped the high tower chambers to crouch beside Miro in the quietest corners of the servant's wing, where the light fell soft and she mended linens by hand. He didn't speak much in those moments. He didn't have to. She never asked what he was avoiding or why his eyes were rimmed with frustration. She simply gave him space, a quiet rhythm, a place to breathe. Miro had become more than habit by then. She was a part of his internal map, the compass rose that pointed not north or south, but toward stillness. And yet, To the rest of the court, she remained an unnamed thing. They didn't understand how a mute servant could become so vital to a prince without a single word to tie them. They looked at her and saw only the way she moved behind him during walks in the garden, never ahead, never asking. Some pitied her, thinking her voicelessness was a burden. Others distrusted her, as if silence might conceal some deeper betrayal. But what most unsettled them was how freely Corin gave her his regard. He began asking for her in public, not with indulgence, but with the casual authority of a boy who understood, instinctively, the weight of his position. At a luncheon with visiting nobles, he refused a plate handed to him by the queen's steward, asking instead for Muriel's bread, because it was what he trusted. When his dog went missing, it was not the guards he summoned but Muriel, because he believed she would understand where the animal had gone without needing to be told. Each gesture was small, easily overlooked, but in a court ruled by symbolism, even a glance could alter alliances. The queen said nothing. She continued her cool governance without interruption, but those beneath her watched. They spoke in corners and shadows, weaving speculation like thread through candle smoke. Muriel herself felt the shift long before it reached her directly. The air around her thickened with the invisible weight of judgment. Conversation stilled when she entered rooms. Instructions once handed to her with ease were now relayed to others, as though her touch might stain the silk. The other handmaidens began to exclude her from their whispered laughter, their nighttime braiding circles, their exchanged glances of sympathy and flirtation. She didn't resent them. She understood. In the palace, safety came not from truth, but from distance, and she had strayed too close to light. She never defended herself. She continued her duties as she always had, with precision, with grace, with a dignity that neither poverty nor silence had ever stripped from her. But privately, in the solitude of her chamber, she began to change. She became more careful with her steps. She kept her eyes lower, even around those who once spoke to her with kindness. And on the night she found a small tear in her apron, a clean cut, as if made by a knife. She said nothing, but took out her old sewing kit and stitched it closed with thread the color of storm clouds. She wore that apron again the next day. She wore it as a quiet answer. It was around this time that she began to prepare something in secret. At the back of her chamber, behind the wooden chest that held spare linens and an old winter cloak, she began to sew a dress from black wool. It was a simple thing, unadorned, but each stitch was perfect, every seam aligned as if it were meant to hold the weight of memory itself. It was not for any official mourning, though she had prepared such garment before. It was not for the queen, who was still healthy, or for the king, whose health was already so diminished that his name was mentioned only in administrative necessity. It was for something else. A shadow she felt gathering, not an illness or death, but an inevitability. She never named it aloud. But each night, she folded a half-finished dress over her lap and sewed by lamplight, the thread catching in the soft flesh of her finger until a small callus formed. It was a kind of preparation that came from knowing how quickly a world could shift. She did not know what would end, only that something would. Corin sensed her quiet worry. He asked more often if she was well. Sometimes he would slip her a note, folded badly, scribbled in a childish script that had only just begun to refine. "Is someone hurting you?" he once wrote, with a drawing of a dagger beside it. Meant more to amuse than to threaten. She had shaken her head and placed a hand over his heart instead, a gesture they both knew meant she was more worried for him than herself. He had smiled, but not brightly. That smile was becoming rarer. The boy who had once danced around her skirts with wildflowers in his hands now sat with too much tension in his shoulders. His tutors reported that he was argumentative, distracted, too fond of asking questions. The queen was informed that he resisted the study of treaties, preferring to sketch battle formations in the margins of his books. Muriel knew that none of this was rebellion. It was longing to be understood, to be real in a world that only asked for performance. In his mind, he was trying to shape himself into something solid, something unshakable. And the more he tried, the more they tried to shape him back. One evening, after a long council session in which Corin was made to sit beside his mother for hours without speaking, Muriel found him alone in the courtyard. He had taken off his shoes and was sitting barefoot in the cold grass, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes fixed on a snail moving slowly along the edge of a stone bench. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He only reached into his coat and pulled out a small carved figure, an owl with one wing unfinished, and placed it in her palm. She held it, not because it was beautiful, but because it was his, because it was made from hours stolen from pressure, because it told her everything he couldn't say. The queen, even in her silence, must have known. She watched them from her private balcony on occasion, her fingers tightening around the railing, but she never intervened. Whether out of indifference or calculation, Muriel could not tell. What she did know was that Elsinora never once asked Muriel to leave her son's company. She never forbade the boy from seeking her out. She allowed the bond to live, even as it twisted the lines of propriety that held the court in place. But the court did not forgive what it could not classify. In whispered meetings and passing remarks, Muriel's presence became a problem to be solved. The Queen's chief lady-in-waiting made subtle changes to Muriel's schedule, assigning her to wings of the palace that kept her further from the prince. Small, unkind tricks began to appear. Hot water turned cold. Linens hidden, her name omitted from lists. The Queen herself never endorsed these acts, but neither did she prevent them. Muriel bore it all without protest. Her place had never been earned through favor. It had been forged in fire, sustained through silence, and tested by years of quiet endurance. She would not be shaken now, and Corin, for all his youth, began to resist in ways that startled the court. He stopped attending lessons taught by tutors who insulted Muriel. He left dinners early when her absence was too obvious. He began referring to her not as a handmaid, but simply Muriel, in tones that dared correction. The nobility stirred uneasily. Some believed he was being manipulated. Others whispered worse, that she was a witch, a curse, a relic from the old bloodlines meant to control him through strange, wordless power. But Muriel never once tried to wield influence. She had never asked for his protection, never spoken a word in her own defense. She remained as she had always been, present, steady, and without ambition. The court, in all its opulence, did not understand that the deepest bonds were often forged in silence. That love, when stripped of performance, could be quieter than breath. That influence need not be declared to endure. They did not see, as Corin saw, that Muriel's power lay not in what she did, but in what she never asked for. And they did not yet know that one day it would be her name, spoken without shame, that would turn the court to silence. The palace changed when the first frost came early. The hedges grew brittle. The lavender wilted too soon, and the stables carried the scent of smoke from distant fields. It was a kind of cold that arrived with warning, not of weather, but of things breaking loose, of structure beginning to fail in the quiet places where no one yet dared speak it aloud. Whispers traveled faster than snowmelt, and by the time the Northern Rebellion had a name, its shadow had already reached the capital. No banners had been raised. No sieges had begun, but the kitchens received less venison. The guard spoke in shorter sentences. The Queen stood longer by the map room window, fingers pressed so tightly to the sill that her knuckles blanched. The King, still nominally alive in his westward chambers, had grown too thin to be seen. Corin's lessons began to shift, focusing less on courtly recitation and more on the art of ruling in absence. At 13, he had grown taller than most boys his age, his voice fuller but not yet surer. His eyes, however, had changed the most, no longer wide with questions, but narrowed with a guarded awareness that Muriel recognized too well. She had seen it first in the firelight of her own youth, when the world had stopped being a place of safety and become instead something that needed watching. She saw that same transformation begin in him, and she hated it, not because it made him less innocent, but because it was necessary. The Queen had begun to summon her advisors more frequently, though she remained behind closed doors, veiled and unsmiling. There were quiet meetings at odd hours, soldiers moving through hallways not meant for their boots, and envoys arriving unannounced from towns too small to matter unless they were burning. Muriel felt the tension not in the words exchanged. She was not permitted to those rooms, but in the silence left in their wake. She noticed which footmen stopped meeting her eyes, which pages no longer played in the courtyard, which guard began carrying their swords more openly. The palace was bracing for something. But no one said what, and so Miro watched. She always had. But now her watching became more than survival. It became a kind of record, etched into quiet folds of her mind, memorized not in names or orders, but in patterns. Who passed where at what hour, with which expression, which rooms remained lit beyond midnight, which bells rang once when they should have rung twice. These details might have meant little to someone with no past and silence, but Miro had long learned that the world gave itself away not in declarations, but in the ways it forgot to lie. Corin grew more restless as the days shortened. He spoke to Miro less with gestures and more with furrowed brows, his body stiff with thoughts he could not yet frame. He had begun to understand a burden waiting for him, and with it came the first shadows of doubt. At night, when she found him seated beside the unlit hearth, his shoulders hunched as if expecting grief to tap between his blades, she would sit beside him without question. He did not lean against her anymore, not since his growth had made him aware of height and space and the dignity he must preserve, but he allowed her nearness, and that, in his language, was still intimacy. One evening, he brought her a letter he had found discarded beside the gatekeeper's chamber. It was unopened, still sealed in wax, and bore the mark of the northern counties, once loyal lands now spoken of only in tones of regret. Miro read the seal, felt the weight of the paper, and returned it without question. He understood. She did not open what was not hers. But later that night, she walked the corridor outside the gatekeeper's chamber and saw no light beneath the door. The next morning, a replacement was named, and no mention was made of the change. The rebellion, still not officially named as such, announced itself more clearly on a brittle morning in early winter. Riders arrived, spine stiff, clothing stained with ash, and Miro overheard the phrase "fire in the Western Vale," spoken 3 times in the space of an hour. One of the pages wept in the stairwell. A boy no older than Corin. No one asked why. Miro brought him a cloth and sat with him until his breathing calmed. He never told her what he had seen. He didn't need to. She had lived through fire once. She knew the smell it left in the soul. The Queen's behavior changed subtly after that day. She became more exacting, more precise in her expectations. Meals were served earlier. Ceremonies were scheduled with sharper punctuality. Servants were replaced without explanation. Miro was not reassigned, but she noticed the eyes on her more often now, assessing, measuring. It was not a demotion nor an accusation. It was something colder, a reminder. She was still only tolerated, and yet her usefulness grew, because no one noticed when she stood behind pillars, because no one silenced her when she was already mute, because no one questioned whether she understood what they said when they believed her incapable of repeating it. It was a week after the riders came that she followed a courtier, Lord Reedon, a cousin to the Queen by marriage, down the long Easter hall toward the courtyard that was never lit at night. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed his cause righteous, not secret. She walked at a distance, her steps a rhythm of dust and memory. He did not hear her. No one ever did. He met with another man. She recognized him not by name but by the silver insignia on his belt, a symbol of family from a northern range. Their voices were low but not careful. They spoke of readiness, of loyalties purchased, of what the Queen cannot hold. Miro stood in shadow, the chill of the wall pressing to her apron, her hands still. She memorized everything, every word, every gesture, the timing, the tone, the promise. She said nothing. She never would. But the next morning, Lord Reedon did not attend the Queen's council, nor did the man from the north return. Their absence was explained in vague terms, an urgent summons, a journey for diplomacy. Miro saw the blood on the steward's cuff, just a drop, not enough to raise alarm. But she knew. The Queen had acted. She had understood the warning, though Miro had never delivered it aloud. Later that evening, Miro returned to her chamber, closed the door gently, and sat by the window where the light fell soft across the floor. She let the silence wash over her, not as a burden but as a shelter. She had done what she could. No one would thank her. No one would know. But Corin had been spared, for now. Her body ached. A bruise bloomed dark across her ribs. a result of being jostled when she returned to the servants' hallway too slowly, and was caught in a rush of guards sent to reinforce the wing. No apology had followed. She didn't expect one. She treated the injury herself, binding the flesh with steady fingers, breathing through the pain as she had since childhood. She had grown used to the ache of being unseen. But sometimes, even silence needs release. That night, as the moonlight fractured through frost on the windows, Corin knocked once at her door and entered without waiting. He had not done that since he was a child. She stood to greet him, unsure, but he walked to her with uncharacteristic urgency and placed a wrapped bundle in her hands. She unfolded it slowly. Inside was a pair of gloves, hand-stitched, the leather soft and warm. She looked up, and his expression held no embarrassment, no need to explain. "You were limping," he said simply. She reached for him then, her fingers brushing his cheek in a gesture that was both thanks and grief and something older than language. He did not move away. The rebellion would not vanish. It would grow, as all things ignored tend to do. The palace had become colder still, more divided, more suspicious. But for that one night, Muriel allowed herself a moment of quiet in which the boy she had raised, without claim, without name, had seen her pain and answered it, not as a prince, not as a son, but as someone who had learned, in her shadow, what love could be when it asked for nothing in return. The palace grew quieter after the purge, not in peace, but in tension, the kind of silence that stretches between thunderclaps. Though no official proclamations were made, though no gallows stood in the courtyard and no banners were lowered in mourning, everyone knew what had happened. Names ceased to appear on rosters. Familiar footsteps no longer echoed in the stone hallways. Certain rooms remained locked, and the Queen's Council sat more stiffly, their hands folded tighter, their eyes more hollow. The rebellion had not broken through the gates, but its reach had been felt. Its breath lingered like fog beneath doorframes. And Elsinora, the queen who had once ruled with calculated attachment, now seemed drawn tighter around a center no one could see. She became sharper in her dealings, more decisive, less patient. Her eyes did not wander as they once had. She answered questions before they were fully asked. She kept the boy, Corin, nearer to her, not in affection, but in preservation, as a proximity could anchor what legacy alone might not. She summoned him to meetings he did not yet understand, had him stand beside her as she signed missives and treaties, watched how he held his pen, how he bowed his head. She began to dress him in darker fabrics, instructed his tutors to adjust his readings to include statecraft, trade embargoes, the collapse of minor provinces. He grew into his role not with excitement, but with quiet, resigned determination. The boy who once pressed feathers into Muriel's hands now folded letters with care and placed seals upon them like they were tombstones. Muriel saw the shift in him, and it carved through her like winter wind. There was no fault in it. It was what the world demanded. The palace had no place for dreamers, no patience for softness, no mercy for the kind of love that lived in shadows. She watched him become what the kingdom needed, and mourned, silently, the boy he had once been. Yet still he came to her, not as often, and not in the same ways. No longer with trinkets, no longer in search of escape. Now he came in the early hours, when the sky was still inked in indigo and the halls empty, his boots echoing too loudly for someone who had once learned to walk softly. He would find her in the servants' antechamber or on the garden steps just before the sun cut its first line across the frost, and he would sit beside her, knees bent, elbows resting on them, eyes focused somewhere far away. They rarely gestured anymore. They didn't need to. She would pass him a cup of warm broth, and he would hold it as if it might vanish. He would glance at her hands, the way they moved over thread or wood or cloth, and something in his own shoulders would ease. Once, she noticed his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the cup, not from cold, from the weight he now carried, from the decisions he had begun to make before he was ready, from the knowledge that each command he spoke, each alliance he tolerated, might cost more than he could yet imagine. The queen, despite her renewed focus on her son's preparation, never softened toward him. She spoke to him not as a mother, but as a sovereign shaping clay. Her words were instructional, her praise rare and clinical. Good, she would say after a successful address. Efficient, after a day of meetings. Never, I'm proud. Never, you did well. Her version of love, if it lived at all, had been buried so deeply beneath duty that no light reached it. And Corin, who once sought her gaze with the quiet ache of a child in need, no longer asked for it. He had stopped waiting for what would never come. It was Muriel who remained his touchstone, even as the court ignored her presence more deliberately now. They no longer whispered openly about her, no longer made jokes in the corridors. They simply behaved as if she did not exist. Her work was acknowledged only when it failed, which it never did. Her tasks were neither increased nor reassigned, but the margins of her place grew narrower, her movements more scrutinized. Her value tethered entirely to her silence. She wore like a second skin. And yet, within that narrowing world, she watched Corin become a man, not through ceremony or title, but through sorrow. The king's death was announced on the final day of snow. It was not unexpected. He had not been seen publicly in nearly a year, but the timing felt precise, almost orchestrated, as if the land itself waited for the last thaw before accepting his passing. No bell rang. The queen did not dress in mourning, and the staff were given no period of public grief. Instead, preparations were made. Quiet ones. Seamstresses worked late into the night, replacing seals on cloaks and altering hems. Banners were re-dyed. Scribes copied odes. And Corin, now 15, was told without ceremony that his training was over. There was no funeral, only a vigil. Muriel watched it from behind the high archway, her face pale in the candlelight, her hands hidden in her sleeves. The queen stood beside her son, her hand resting on his arm, not in comfort, but in solidarity. Corin did not cry. His mouth was a firm line. His eyes did not blink. He bowed his head when the rites were read, and raised it again with a poise Muriel knew cost him dearly. When it was done and the room emptied, he remained by the altar, staring at the single flame that burned atop the stone. She approached slowly, the way she always had, her footsteps a whisper. He did not turn, but when she placed her hand on his shoulder, he leaned into it just slightly, the way one does when gravity becomes too much. They stayed like that for a long time, until the candle shrank and the chill returned. Then he straightened, nodded once, and left. After that night, Muriel's role became both more invisible and more essential. She no longer served directly in the queen's chambers. Whether by design or diplomacy, her position was altered without announcement. She now worked primarily in the outer wing of the palace, where foreign guests were housed, where the rugs were thinner and the drafts more constant. On paper, it was a demotion. In truth, it was a shield. Muriel suspected the queen no longer wanted her so near. Not out of spite, but out of control. Elsa Nora had given Corin what she could. She would not tolerate anyone else giving him more. Still, Corin found her. He began writing letters. Not formal ones, not addressed with seals, but folded pages slipped into the pockets of her apron, left beneath her mending kits, pressed into the spines of books he knew she touched. The letters were short, sometimes only a line or two. I don't know if I did the right thing. They're lying about the grain shortage. I miss when things made sense. Sometimes they were simply questions. Do you remember when I tried to fly from the west wall with the stable sheets? Do you ever miss the nursery? Did you ever think I'd make it this far? She answered not with ink, but with action. She made his favorite bread and left it wrapped in cloth on the steps he passed each morning. She placed a small carved bird in his study, the one he had given her years ago but half-finished, now complete, painted its wing hole. She repaired the hem of his ceremonial cloak before his first royal hearing, knowing he would forget to ask. She never spoke. She never wrote. But every answer was there. The queen watched her son with the eyes of a monarch, securing legacy, not a mother mourning a husband. Her grief, if it existed, remained locked behind 1,000 layers of silk and expectation. Muriel once passed her in the hallway and saw something flicker across Elsa Nora's expression. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to recognition. But it passed too quickly to be named. That spring, Corin held his first full court. He wore the king's ring, though it was slightly too large, and the queen sat beside him not in power, but in council. When the nobles gathered, Muriel remained in the servants' gallery, hidden from sight but not from knowledge. She watched as he spoke with firmness, listened with patience, and withheld judgment until the room quieted. He had learned well, but not from the throne. That evening, long after the court had dispersed and the moon sat low and fat above the palace, Corin returned to the eastern garden. Miro was already there, tending the soil around the snowdrops. He knelt beside her, hands still ink-stained from his day. For a while, they worked in silence. Then he reached into his coat and placed something beside her on the ground, a folded slip of parchment. She opened it slowly. In it, only 2 words, "Still yours." She did not cry. She had forgotten how, but her breath caught in her chest, and she placed her hand over the note as though it might flutter away in the wind. He rose and walked back toward the palace, tall now and certain, and deeply alone in a way only those destined to rule could be. But Miro watched him with the steadiness of someone who had never asked for a title, who had never claimed a role, and yet had been, quietly, unfalteringly, the one to raise a king, not with a name, not with a voice, but with presence and patience, and a love that asked for nothing but stayed through everything. The crown was not yet cold from its predecessor's brow when Corin was named king. No feast was held. No great procession swept through the city. No jubilant cry rose from the hearts of the people. It was a coronation of necessity, not celebration. Quiet and cold, like a torch lit in wind. The ceremony was brief, marked by perfunctory blessings and careful pronouncements. The queen stood beside him only until the last vow was spoken, then withdrew to her private chamber with the grace of a ruler who had finished her duty and wished never again to speak of it. The kingdom had changed hands not with thunder, but with the soft thud of a door closing behind her. Corin stood beneath the golden archway where past kings had once declared wars, and his voice did not shake, though his hands trembled at his sides when he thought no one could see. His crown, custom forged in the final weeks of winter, sat heavily on his brow. It had not yet grown to fit him. Miro watched from the gallery reserved for the lesser servants, her gray gown blending into the stone around her. She had no title, no place in the noble circles that hovered near the dais, no right to claim recognition in this moment. But she watched him not as a subject, not even as a mother, though something deeper than blood pulsed beneath her ribs. She watched as one watches a boy step into water too deep, knowing he would not return the same. He had worn black for the ceremony, the mourning cloak still fastened beneath his royal sash, and when the priest spoke the final rites of succession, Corin had not looked at the queen, nor at the assembled court. He had looked up, just briefly, toward the arch of the gallery where she stood. Their eyes met, only for a second. But in that second, the whole weight of their shared past passed between them like a thread, pulled taut and invisible. The days that followed moved like machines wound too tightly. Each event preordained, each decision executed with the clinical rhythm of a court terrified of change. Corin received foreign envoys with a stiffness he had not yet unlearned. He listened more than he spoke, nodded more than he questioned. He allowed his advisors to speak for him in the early councils, though Miro saw the flicker in his eyes when their words veered from what he believed. He was learning, fast and in silence, how to endure the cost of power, and it cost more with every hour. He requested that Miro be allowed to continue her work within the palace, though his advisors objected on principle. No monarch had ever retained a mute servant from their childhood. They reminded him it would look improper. It would invite questions. She was not of noble stock. She had no title, no allegiance outside her own silence. She had never even sworn fealty aloud. But Corin, already practiced in the quiet exertion of power, said only that she remained. No explanation, no room for argument. And so she remained, though her duties shifted once more. She was no longer assigned to the servants' wing, nor the queen's former chambers. Instead, a small space was prepared for her in the stone annex adjacent to the study, where Corin now spent most of his time. It was not grand, only a room with a single window, a narrow bed, and a chair by the hearth, but it was hers and near him. Her days were spent in tasks that were not recorded. She cleaned parchment from the desk when his meetings ended. She left tea to steep at the hour she knew he would begin to tire. She mended the lining of his cloaks, adjusted the length of his sleeves when his growth caught up to his rank, swept the ash from the fireplace before dawn. He never assigned these things to her. He never asked, but they were done because she knew what he needed before he did, and because he allowed her nearness where no one else dared to enter without summons. In the eyes of court, she was a shadow once again, but now her shadow fell behind the throne. There was talk, always muted, that the king relied too heavily on silence, that he conferred too privately, that his counsel lacked balance, but none could accuse him of failure. The early months of his reign were marked not by conquest, but by restoration. Corin lowered taxes in the outer provinces, which had borne the brunt of the northern rebellion's scorch. He restored lands to families who had suffered under noble overreach. He summoned scholars, not generals, to advise him on the drought that threatened the eastern crop. He gave careful answers in public, generous ones in private. He ruled as one who had learned compassion, not from command, but from witness. It was during one of his late study sessions, Miro seated quietly by the hearth, darning the edge of a fraying banner, that he spoke the word that would unfasten the very foundation of courtly decorum. "What do you think, Mother?" His voice had been calm, almost too calm, as though he had tried the word silently first, then decided to say it aloud. Miro froze. Her needle caught mid-loop. The word hung in the air like smoke, warm, ungraspable, and devastating. He did not correct himself. She did not respond. He said it again, softer this time, but with more certainty. "Mother." Then he looked at her, not with question, not with apology, but with the quiet defiance of someone who had chosen truth over expectation. The court did not hear it that night, but the walls did, and the walls, in that palace, had always whispered. Within a week, the word had reached every ear worth hearing. It became a matter of speculation first, then scandal. Nobles laughed it off with raised brows. Servants traded it like gossip wrapped in gold. Some accused Miro of sorcery, others of seduction, still others of forging a claim on the king's affections through manipulation. But none dared confront Corin directly. He had grown into a ruler who listened closely and punished precisely. He never repeated the word in public, but in the way he looked at her, addressed her, chose her presence in moments of need, it was there to answer the murmur. The court held a feast in early summer, a carefully orchestrated display meant to reinforce hierarchy, remind the nobles of tradition, and return balance to the perception of the new reign. Corin attended, as expected, dressed in white and gold, flanked by advisors. The queen, still alive but more a figure than a force, was absent. The halls glowed with candlelight. Music played. Wine flowed. But when the first toast was called in the king's name, Corin turned to the steward and asked clearly, "Has Miro been seated?" The steward hesitated. There was no seat for her. "Find her one," Corin said, and though he did not raise his voice, it rang louder than any bell. And so she was seated, not near him, not among the nobles, but in the hall in sight, her gray gown stark among silks and jewels. The room shifted like ice cracking. Conversation stumbled. No one dared address her, but no one could ignore her either. Corin raised his cup. To those who raise kings not through name, but through presence. It was not an apology. It was not a defense. It was a declaration. And Miro, seated at the end of a table that had never welcomed her, did not bow. She inclined her head. She held his gaze. And she stayed. After the feast, Corin commissioned a painting. It was not meant for the gallery, nor for display in any hall. It was painted in secret in the small studio beside the eastern courtyard, where ivy crept along the windows and light entered softly. He summoned the artist himself. Miro never posed, never sat, but the artist came to know her through glimpses, through sketches made from memory, from observation. The final work showed her not in royal dress, not in grandeur, but as she was, seated with hands folded in her lap, eyes distant, a single snowdrop held between her fingers. Behind her, not a throne, but a child's bed. The title was simple, Mother of the Quiet Years. Corin hung it in his private chamber. Only those he trusted were allowed to see it. Miro never asked why he had done it. He never offered explanation. But the first time she saw it, Her hand rose slowly to her chest and stayed there for a long time, as if anchoring something that had always floated just beyond her reach. She had served the queen in silence, endured the court without praise, raised a boy without title or name. And now, in the stillness of a reign just beginning, she was no longer invisible, not because the world saw her, but because he did. And that, to her, was enough. The court did not explode with outrage the moment the king called Myrrel mother. It seethed instead, slow, subterranean, like water collecting behind a dam long neglected. No cries of protest were raised in the throne room. No accusations were cast during the morning addresses. The nobles had learned the temperament of their new sovereign well enough to know that direct confrontation would earn them only silence or dismissal. But behind closed doors, behind fans and folded letters, behind the latticework of etiquette and inheritance, they whispered. They whispered until whispering became doctrine, until their outrage, masked by protocol, began to shape a new reality. They did not question Myrrel's character outright. That would have been inelegant and worse, unstrategic. They questioned her history, her origin, her right to proximity. They asked, carefully, hypothetically, if it was wise for a king to hold such affection for a servant with no documented lineage, no noble sponsor, no blood that could be traced across the pages of dynastic charts. They asked, in tones painted with concern, what it meant for monarchy's dignity when the one closest to the king could not speak for herself. They asked if his compassion was clouding his discernment, if his grief, unspoken though visible, had left him vulnerable to sentimentality. But what they feared, though none dared name it, was something older and more dangerous than affection. They feared legitimacy, not the legitimacy of a claim to blood, for no one could pretend Myrrel bore corn from her own body. No, what they feared was emotional legitimacy, that Myrrel, silent and without title, had come to occupy the place that mothers were meant to fill in thrones and temples and tales, that she had become, not by decree but by duration, not by inheritance but by presence, the soul who shaped a king. Corin did not retract a word. He did not repeat it either. But from that moment forward, the lines between servant and sovereign softened in ways no law could codify. Myrrel remained in her modest quarters near his study, still wearing her gray gowns, still walking the corridors like a shadow softened by years of sunlight. She did not enter meetings of state. She did not attend assemblies. She asked for nothing. But the nobility watched her with fresh intensity, searching for signs of influence, of ambition, of the faintest overstep that could be struck down in the name of decorum. What they found, maddeningly, was nothing. Myrrel remained as she had always been, observant, quiet, precise in her duties. But Corin, knowingly or not, began to change the landscape around her. He appointed chamberlains who did not flinch at her presence. He reassigned attendants who whispered too freely in the wrong corridors. He never spoke of her in edicts, but small details gave her stature. The way he paused when she entered a room, the way he deferred to her silence with the gravity one usually reserved for counsel. Once, during a dispute between two lords over rights to a hill-land border, he ended the argument not with verdict or threat, but with a single gesture. He reached into the folds of his robe, withdrew a small carved bird, and placed it between them. The object meant nothing to the lords, but it meant everything to him, to Myrrel, to what had been built quietly across a decade of shared breath. She watched all this with a mixture of pain and pride, a feeling as heavy as morning and as fragile as spring. She had not asked for this role. She had never wished to be seen. In the early days of her service, anonymity had been her only shelter. And now, suddenly, she was being watched not with pity, but with expectation. She responded the only way she knew, by withdrawing even further into her tasks. She cleaned the ink pots twice as often. She rose before the city bells. She tended to the linens herself rather than let others mishandle them. She repaired a broken latch in Corin's chamber door without his knowledge, shaping the metal silently in the middle of the night, her hands blistered by mourning. But it was not a penance. It was preservation. In work, she still knew who she was. But something had shifted within her, too. She began to dream, not in the fevered, terrifying ways she had known as a child. Those old dreams of fire, of voices trapped in smoke, of reaching for family who no longer existed. These new dreams were quieter, stranger, almost tender. She dreamed of snowdrops blooming from stone, of the sound of a child's laugh she could almost remember, of a name, her own, spoken aloud by someone she no longer recognized. She would wake with the echo of it on her tongue, the shape of speech trembling against lips that had not parted for sound in 20 years. She would sit on the edge of her cot in the dark, pressing her fingers to her throat, as though searching for a key long buried. One morning, she found herself in the Royal Library before sunrise. It was not a place she frequented often, though Corin had loved it as a child. She had no need of books, but she stood there for a long while, tracing the spines of histories and fictions and treaties, until she found a small, dust-covered volume wedged between two forgotten atlases. It had no title on the binding, only a faded embossing of a tree, its branches bare. Inside it was a book of names, not noble ones, not kings or generals, just names, birth names, gathered from across the kingdom, each followed by a line of verse or memory. She flipped through it slowly, her fingers catching on a page that made her breath stop. The name was not hers, but it was close, so close it felt like something long buried exhaling through the centuries. She tore the page from the binding, not violently but with reverence, and carried it back to her chamber. That night, she lit a candle and watched the flame flicker against the parchment. Then she burned it. She did not need to keep it. She only needed to let it go. The next morning, a boy arrived in the palace. He was small, perhaps 8 years old, with ash-blonde hair and a face hollowed by hunger. He did not speak, not out of refusal, but out of injury. His voice, the steward said, had been damaged in the winter raid of a coastal village. He had no family. The queen's physicians had tended to his wounds, but no one knew what to do with him. Corin, upon hearing the report, had issued a simple instruction: bring him to Myrrel. She had not asked for the task. She had not looked for it. But when the boy was led to her, wide-eyed and silent, her hands moved instinctively. She knelt before him, placed a palm flat against his chest, then against her own, and waited. He did not flinch. He stared at her, something old flickering in his gaze, and nodded once. That night, he slept curled at the foot of her bed, his breath steady for the first time in days. Over the weeks that followed, she taught him the same language she had once crafted with Corin. Not a formal system of signs, but a living one, a shared breath between hands and eyes. The boy took to it quickly, as though he had been waiting all his life to learn it. He named things not with sound, but with shape. He drew sparrows in the dust. He touched his hand to his heart when he wished to say safe. When he finally gestured the word mother, Myrrel did not cry, but she took his hand in hers and held it for a long time. Corin visited them often, not in royal display, but as himself, a young man weighed down by rule, searching for peace in a place that reminded him of who he had once been. He brought the boy books, with shavings, a small bird whistle carved from cedar. Once, he brought Myrrel a rose pressed in vellum and said only, "For the day you forget who you are." She kept it folded in her pocket, not to remember, but to honor that someone else did. And then, one evening, as she watched the boys sleep and the firelight flicker over the walls of her quiet chamber, she rose. She moved to her small writing table, untouched for years, and opened a drawer that had not been opened since her first days in service. Inside was a single, torn scrap of parchment, the one she had once written her name upon, decades ago, in a moment of grief she could no longer fully recall. The ink had faded. The letters were almost illegible. She stared at it, her breast shallow, then fed it gently to the flame. She no longer needed that name. It had been hers once, in the world before the fire, before the palace, before silence. But she was not that girl now. She was not the shadow of a village lost to ash. She was not merely the servant of a queen, nor even the silent handmaid to a throne. She was Myrrel. She was mother, and they could call her what they liked. She had nothing to prove. She had already raised a king. The boy who came to Myrrel in silence stayed. He was given no title, no designation beyond a quiet space near the herb garden, a wool blanket, and Myrrel's hand as a guide. He arrived like so many had before him, unclaimed, unnamed, a child carved from war's wake. His village had been scorched in the final throes of rebellion, when stray factions clung to violence like drowning men to driftwood. He had been found beneath a collapsed beam, soot-covered and breathing in gas that sounded like whispering gravel. His throat had not healed properly. The royal physician said the damage was likely permanent. Whatever voice he had once had now lived only in the tremor of his chest and the widening of his eyes. When he was brought to Myrrell, he flinched at every movement. His gaze darted from corner to corner as though expecting walls to cave. He stood with the rigid stillness of someone who had learned that motion drew pain. Myrrell, watching him from the doorway of her chamber, saw more than trauma. She saw recognition, not in the way of shared experience, but in the marrow, in the unspeakable bond between those who had carried their grief too long without ever releasing it into sound. She did not speak. She did not reach for him. She simply knelt, as she had once done for Corin, and placed her hand to her chest, then to his. The boy stared at her, eyes glassy, until something loosened in his shoulders and he mirrored the gesture. It was not understanding. It was not trust, but it was the first breath that was not defense. That was enough. They named him quietly, Thalen, after the old word for ember. He had not chosen it. He had not asked for it. But when Corin offered it during a rare visit to Myrrell's quarters, the boy nodded once, fingers tracing the outline of the word in the dust beside the hearth. It suited him. He was not aflame. Not yet. But something lived in him still, something that had refused to die even as fire took everything else. Myrrell taught him with the same patience she had once offered Corin, but now tempered by years of reflection. She no longer doubted the worth of her silence. It had become her strength, her domain, her inheritance. And she passed it to Thalen not as a burden, but as a gift. Their language was forged in gestures and glances, in shared time, in the placement of objects. A stone laid gently in a bowl meant remember. A reed by the door meant stay close. A twisted ribbon tied around a candle meant safe. They built a world that did not need to be spoken to be known. Thalen flourished slowly, as all fragile things do. In the early days, he barely slept. He would wake at the smallest shift in shadow and sit upright, fists clenched, body taut with instinctive fear. Myrrell did not try to soothe him with false comfort. Instead, she taught him the rituals of anchoring. A bowl of warm water before bed, the feel of his own heartbeat under his palm, the repetition of morning light through the lattice window, how it always arrived even after the blackest night. Gradually, the tremors in his limbs eased, the bruises faded, and once, when Myrrell handed him a strip of cloth to tie his hair away from his face, he laughed, not aloud, but in breath. In the sudden shaking exhale of joy remembered, she felt it like a tremor in her own chest. The palace, ever wary of what it could not classify, kept its distance. Thalen was neither ward nor prisoner, neither heir nor servant. He was a child with no past that could be verified and no future anyone had claimed. Some called him Myrrell's foundling, others Corin's charity. The latter was closer to the truth. Corin had taken one look at the boy, his small frame too thin beneath the oversized tunic, and said he stays, with a finality that left no room for protest. But it was Myrrell who became his anchor, Myrrell who combed his hair and taught him how to carve sparrows from pine, Myrrell who walked with him along the palace walls until he could sleep again. She watched his hands grow steadier over time. His gaze grew more direct. He began to sign words with more confidence, creating combinations that Myrrell had not taught but immediately understood. Earth memory for home, broken light for grief, Fireheart for himself. His mind was nimble, more curious and fearful now, and he had a gift for seeing patterns others missed. When Corin visited, Thalen would greet him with a respectful nod and then draw him toward whatever discovery had captured his thoughts. A leaf shaped like a crescent moon, a stone that hummed faintly when struck, a nest tucked into the crook of the stable's rafter. Corin, already heavy with the weight of his reign, found in these visits a kind of reprieve. Myrrell saw it in the way he smiled more freely when Thalen was near, the way he lingered longer, as though remembering who he had once been. Thalen became, in time, a fixture not only of Myrrell's world but of Corin's court. He attended no councils, but word of him spread, softly, hesitantly, like the first signs of spring thaw. Nobles began to ask about the silent boy who had captured the king's interest. Some speculated he was being groomed for some future station. Others whispered that he was dangerous, a child with no origin, plucked from war's detritus to be shaped into a blade of influence. But most, in truth, did not know what to make of him. He did not speak. He did not scheme. He simply existed, unwavering in his presence beside Myrrel, blooming quietly beneath her hand. Myrrel, for a part, found in Thalen a reflection of herself, not as she was now, but as she had once been. And through that reflection, something in her softened. She began to smile more openly. Her fingers, once always occupied with work, now lingered on tasks not required, plucking lavender to press into his pillow, braiding his hair into careful knots, teaching him the lullabies she once remembered only in rhythm. She no longer feared being seen. She no longer tried to vanish in corridors or avert her gaze when nobles passed. She had walked in shadow long enough to know how to carry herself in light. It was Corin who first noticed how much she had changed during one of his quiet visits. Just past dusk, when the castle windows glowed gold and the halls were hushed with the lull of closing day, he sat beside Myrrel as Thalen read silently from a primer of wild herbs. The king said little at first, only watched the boy's finger trail beneath the illustrations. Then, after a pause, he turned to Myrrel and said, "He looks at you like I used to." She did not react immediately, but her hand, resting near a half-mended shawl, stilled. Corin did not press her. He waited, knowing that silence was not absence. Eventually, she nodded. "I know what it means to be carried by someone's steadiness," he said, softer now. "To learn love without being told what it is." He looked over at Thalen, who had now fallen asleep with the book open across his chest. "I think he does too." That night, as Myrrel tucked the boy beneath the wool blanket and extinguished the lamp, she lingered by the window. The moon was rising slow and full. Beneath it, the city lay hushed and glinting, unaware of the quiet transformation that had unfolded within the palace's innermost rooms. She breathed in deeply, the scent of thyme and cedar carried on the evening breeze, and let her fingers rest against the window pane. For the first time in years, she felt something shift not within the world, but within herself. Not grief, not survival, but continuity. Legacy. She had not borne children. She had never married, never spoken vows, never traced her lineage through parchment or crest. And yet, here she stood, mother to a king, guardian to a boy born from ash, and no longer invisible. She had once thought her purpose fulfilled in Corin, and perhaps it had been. But love, she realized now, was not bound by a single name or shape. It widened. It made room. It found new forms, even the shadow of old wounds. Thalen was not a replacement. He was an echo and also beginning. Later that week, Myrrel walked to the archives. She did not speak. She did not knock. But she handed the scribe a slip of paper upon which she had written a single request. It read, "Thalen of the House of Silence, Ward to Myrrel the Grove." The scribe raised his eyes, uncertain. But Myrrel met his gaze without flinching. The request was recorded. That night, Thalen found the paper folded on his pillow. He read it slowly, fingers tracing the ink. Then he turned to Myrrel, eyes wide with question, and she nodded once. Yes, it was his. Yes, he belonged. And with that, the House of Silence, unnamed for so long, breathed into life. Quietly, gently, without proclamation. A house not of banners, not of blood, but of presence, of healing, of those who chose to stay. It began with ink, a single drop, dark and undistinguished, that fell from a freshly opened bottle and bled across the corner of a parchment too important to stain. Corin had been reviewing a treaty from the southern borderlands, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked alone in the soft light of evening. The hour was late enough that most of the court had retired, and the halls beyond the chamber stretched empty and echoing. Only the hearth burned, and Myrrel, ever nearby, was seated in the corner with her mending, the rhythmic pull-thread keeping time with the slow turning of parchment beneath the king's hand. She had grown accustomed to these hours, quiet and undemanding, filled with nothing more than the sound of quill on paper and the flicker of flames. In this hush, she found peace. In this hush, she remembered the boy he had once been and allowed herself the stillness to grieve what time had remade. But that night, something was wrong. It was not the ink itself. It was a bottle. The way it had been sealed, the slight bitterness in its scent as it hit the air, sharp and sour, almost metallic. Muriel's senses, honed by decades of tending, of noticing, of surviving, stirred instantly. She rose without conscious thought, crossing the chamber before the boy she had raised could dip his pen. Her hand struck the bottle from his grip with enough force to send it clattering to the floor, and the sound, so sudden, so violent, rang through the chamber like the crack of glass. Corin stood, startled, a line of fresh ink still gleaming along the edge of his thumb. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then he looked down at the mess, his expression narrowing in confusion. Muriel, trembling now, stepped forward, pulled the quill from his hand, and brought the bottle to her nose. A faint tremor passed through her shoulders. Her breath caught. She turned toward him, the bottle held like a relic between them. And for the first time in over 20 years, she tried to speak. The word did not come as she expected. It was not clear. It did not form easily. It tore its way from her throat with a rawness that sounded more like a wound than a voice. But it came. Poison. Corin stared at her. The word hung between them like an impossible thing, heavy with the weight of decades unspoken. Muriel stood motionless after it left her, as if stunned by her own body. Her throat ached, her chest burned, but the word had emerged, broken, hushed, undeniable. The silence that followed was different than the ones that had filled their lives. This one was dense with shock and awe and something holy. A moment later, the king moved. He summoned the steward first, his voice sharp but controlled, then the palace physician, and then, finally, the guards. The ink was taken, the bottle sealed, the paper examined. By the end of the hour, 2 scribes had been detained, and by morning, one had confessed. The poison had been subtle, slow acting, meant not to kill instantly but to wear down, to drain strength, to hollow out the mind over weeks. A soft death, the kind that left room for speculation and decay. The kind best suited to untraceable betrayal. The plot was traced back to a minor house that had once backed a rebellion, now operating under the veil of diplomatic restoration. Their representative had left the court 3 days earlier. Corin issued no public statement, no execution, no display. He simply wrote a letter to the head of the house and sealed it with the royal emblem. No one but Muriel knew what it contained. The courier returned pale and silent, but the incident itself, once known, could not be contained. News of the attempt reached the court within days, and from there spread to the city and beyond. It was not the assassination that captivated the realm. It was the woman who had stopped it, the mute servant, the one who had been seen but never spoken of, who had once walked unseen behind the queen and now stood beside the king. Muriel, silent for a lifetime, had spoken, and with that single word, she had saved the throne. The palace changed in the days that followed, not in structure, but in breath. People looked at her differently now, not with pity nor with suspicion, but with a quiet reverence that made her feel both seen and fragile. Servants bowed more deeply. Nobles avoided her eyes, as if unsure how to reconcile their whispered doubts with the truth that now stood undeniable. Children stared at her in the corridors. Pages ran when she passed. Even the queen, drawn from her self-imposed seclusion by the rumors, sent for Muriel but received no reply. Muriel herself remained unchanged in her movement, but within her, something had ruptured. That night had left her shaken, not just because of the danger, but because of the voice that had broken through silence. She had lived so long without speaking that her body had almost forgotten how. The effort had left her dizzy, her throat raw. But more than that, it had left her with memory, old, unbidden, violent. For days after, she dreamt of fire again, not the one that had blackened her home, but the moments before, the scent of bread still baking, her brother's bare feet against the packed earth, the way her mother's voice had lilted through the doorway. These memories came not in fragments, but in full scenes, as though something in the act of speaking had reopened a vault she had long buried. She would wake with tears on her cheeks, and not know if they came from grief or grace. Corin remained near. He did not ask her to explain. He did not press her to speak again. He simply stayed. In the evenings, he returned to the same chamber where the ink had spilled, and she sat where she always had. Nothing was said of the moment they had shared, but the air between them was thicker now, like the space after a confession too intimate to name. He watched her differently, not with wariness, but with awe, as if realizing that he had known only part of her all these years. Not less, but not all. One night, as the coals dimmed low on the hearth, he turned to her and asked, "Did it hurt?" She understood. She nodded once. He nodded too, and said nothing more. Thalen, too, sensed a shift. The boy had become increasingly attuned to the silences between people. In the days after the poisoning, he stayed closer to Myrrel, his gestures more careful, his gaze more searching. Once, he brought her a bowl of snowdrops, freshly picked from the grove she tended, and placed it beside her without explanation. It was his way of naming the moment, of marking it not with fear, but with beauty. It was Myrrel who began to teach him new signs after that, not the ones they had built for daily use, but ones that carried deeper meaning. The gesture for memory, for truth, for forgive. She taught him how to sign voice, not as sound, but as essence. Thalen, ever watchful, absorbed them quickly. When he signed Mother, now, he did so with a gravity that reflected not only her place in his life, but his recognition of her strength. But there was more to come. The court, having absorbed the shock, now turned to ritual. The attempt on the king's life could not go unanswered in form, even if it had been addressed in function. The High Council proposed a public day of reckoning, a gathering in the central square, where loyalty could be reaffirmed and justice symbolically restored. They suggested that Myrrel be honored in ceremony. Corin refused, not out of rejection, but out of protection. "She saved my life in silence," he said, "and I will not make a spectacle of it." Instead, he did something quieter and far more enduring. He commissioned a second painting, not of Myrrel alone, and not for display in the royal chamber. This one would hang in the entry hall of the House of Records, where generations of scribes, historians, and children of the kingdom passed daily. The painting showed the moment of her reaching, the instant before the bottle was knocked away. Her face was turned toward Corin, her hand outstretched, her eyes wide not with fear, but with certainty. In the corner, the quill hovered in midair, and in the lower margin, etched in small, silver lettering, were two words. Asterisk, she spoke. Asterisk. Myrrel saw the painting only once. She stood before it with Thalen at her side, both of them cloaked against the autumn wind that now threaded through corridors. She stared at her own face for a long time, then turned and walked away without a word, not because it was wrong, but because it was true. And truth, Myrrel knew, did not require applause, only remembrance. There came a time when the palace no longer needed Myrrel's hands. Not because they had grown feeble, nor because her skill had lessened, but because the place she had built, the life she had carved in silence and steadiness, had taken root beyond her tending. The kingdom was no longer the fractured, brittle thing it had once been in Corin's youth. The scars of rebellion had faded into story. The long-fought battles of land and trust had softened into policy and custom. Corin had become not just king, but leader, one whose rule bore the quiet imprint of someone raised to listen. And Thalen, still young but no longer fragile, had grown into his name, his fire subtle but steady, his eyes clear, his presence magnetic in a way that only those shaped by deep wounds and deep care can be. Myrrel began to feel the world loosening around her, not in rejection, but in invitation. The hallways that once echoed with the press of her bare feet now welcomed newer footsteps. Pages who had once watched her with reverence now nodded with familiarity. Servants who once whispered about her now smiled, offering her ripe fruit or new cloth. Small offerings of gratitude she never asked for, but always received with a quiet nod. The court had long since stopped questioning who she was. She had been woven into the palace like ivy across old stone, impossible to uproot without breaking the wall itself. But in her own body, she felt change. It began in her hands, where the chill of winter took longer to leave her fingers, where the thread slipped more often through callous skin. Her joints ached when she rose. Her breaths, One so shallow they were nearly invisible, now came with a weight behind them, as though the years she had carried in silence were finally asking to be felt. She moved slower, sat longer, and found herself staring at light in ways she once hadn't, watching how it filtered through lattice, how it gilded dust, how it made small things beautiful. She did not resist this soft unwinding. She had never feared age. She had never expected to arrive at it. In her youth, life had seemed something so easily stolen. To have lived long enough to grow old was a kind of defiance. To do so in peace was a grace. Corin noticed before she said anything. One morning, as he entered her chamber with his cloak still dusted from travel, he paused, stared at her seated by the fire, and did not speak for a long while. She had fallen asleep in her chair, the embroidery on her lap unfinished, her chin resting gently against her collarbone. When she stirred, she found him there beside her, his expression quiet. "I can take care of things now," he said simply, his voice warm. She nodded. She placed her hand on his arm, not to protest, but to bless the transition. Within the week, she was moved, not in exile, not in secrecy, but in ceremony. The king issued a decree, brief and elegant, announcing the foundation of the Grove House, a small dwelling on the western edge of the palace grounds, nestled beyond the garden walls where snowdrops bloomed even in the earliest cold. It was a sanctuary, not a retirement. Its purpose was to preserve memory, to offer shelter, to teach silence. Miro made the space her own with the same restraint and care she had always applied to her life. The rooms were modest: a small hearth, a table with 2 chairs, a cot beside a window that caught the morning light, and a chest in which she kept only what mattered: a carved bird, a scrap of lavender lace, a wooden spoon, its bowl worn smooth by time. She kept no portraits, no letters, no relics of grandeur, only things touched by hands, warmed by breath. Children came to her in the seasons that followed, orphans from the coasts, sons and daughters of war-touched mothers, boys who stuttered, girls who wept without knowing why. They came not because they were told to, but because stories had spread. They came for stillness, for guidance that did not demand, for a presence that did not diminish them with instruction. Miro taught them all, not with rules, not with formality, but with gesture, with food, with song hummed in rhythm and breath that could be shaped into knowing. She taught them that silence was not lack, that stillness was not absence, that to be quiet was not to be powerless. Thalen helped her in these lessons. He had grown into a young man by then, his shoulders stronger, his hands calloused not from labor but from craft. He had become a healer, trained by the best physicians the realm could offer. But it was in the grove that he returned to root himself. He brought the children herbs, bandaged their cuts, listened to what they could not say. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. Like Miro, he had learned how to hold the world without crushing it. Corin visited each week, no longer the boy she once carried, but not yet entirely free of that history. He came without guards, without robes, often without words. He would sit beside her on the wooden bench beneath the snowdrop tree, hands clasped, eyes closed, and breathe. Sometimes they would speak in signs, sometimes not at all. There was a peace between them that did not require reaffirmation. She had been the beginning of his becoming, and now at the end of her path, she remained his anchor still. He called her Miro in public now, not the servant, not even mother, though the latter still escaped in private moments, soft as prayer. When nobles asked about her, he would smile and say only, "She taught me how to listen." It was enough. In a world built on speaking, it was revolutionary. Miro did not keep track of time in those final years. She marked the days by the blooming of plants, the shifting of birds, the return of particular winds. Her body continued to slow, but her spirit did not wither. She still rose with the sun, though it took her longer. She still braided hair, ground herbs, kneaded bread, though her hands had learned a more careful pace. She still sat beside the children at dusk, watching as they traced stars in the air with their fingers. She still laughed, quietly but freely. And then one morning, she did not rise. There was no violence in it, no struggle. The air in the chamber was still warm, the snowdrops on the table still fresh. She was seated in her chair, her shawl draped across her shoulders, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her eyes were closed. Her breath had stopped. Thalen found her. He did not cry immediately. He knelt beside her, took her hand, and pressed it to his heart. Then he sat beside her until the sun rose fully, until the first child arrived and understood, in the way children sometimes do, that something sacred had passed. Corin came before the end of the day. He entered the Grove house alone. No guards, no escribes, no fanfare. He sat beside her, now laid upon the cot, her body wrapped in linen, her face at peace. He took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and whispered the only word that ever needed to be said. Thank you. There was no state funeral, no public pyre. By her wishes, she was buried beneath the tree where the snowdrops first bloomed. The stone was simple. No crest, no title, only her name and a single line carved below. She stayed. On the day of her burial, the bells rang, not in mourning but in reverence, not for a queen, not for a noble, but for a woman who had held a kingdom together without ever raising her voice. People gathered in silence. No speeches, no declarations, only a procession of those she had touched. Children, servants, courtiers, kings. They came bearing snowdrops and laid them at her feet. In the years that followed, the Grove house remained. It became a place of study, of healing, of refuge. No one claimed it as theirs. It was Muriel's still, though she had passed. The children who learned their past on her ways. The house of silence endured. And her legacy, like her life, did not shout. It whispered, in the steady breath of those she'd loved, in the hands that healed without claim, in the quiet that taught how to be whole. She had been orphan, servant, shadow, anchor, mother, and in the end, simply Muriel,